I mean, we welcome everyone this morning. We have it's the beginning of a day of work, of collaborative work, really, that draws from Frederick Naumann Stiftung and, of course, LSE IDEAS as well. It's an opportunity for us to showcase some of the work that we can collectively do on questions of importance of the day. I just want to emphasize first and foremost that this is a time where liberal institutions are in some ways under assault, and that liberal foundations and liberal institutions, the universities, are really at the front ground, as it were, of this particular challenge. And I want us to recognize in that regard that the work that we're doing is significant in ways that perhaps in the past might have been just academic. So I want us to recognize that, and in that regard, if I could just turn it over to say a few things. Yes, thank you.
Yes, good morning all together. It's a great pleasure to be here at LSE, and a great honor. I have just had a few talks before we started. You know, this is the place where Ralph Dahrendorf was. The spirit of Ralph Dahrendorf is still around, I guess.
I was a student here when he was president.
Yeah. No, he also was president of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation in the 1980s. So for me, it's a great honor to be one of his, with my small feet in his big shoes, to be one of his followers. But I may add in this place that his ideas and his judgment about the changes of globalization and what he predicted are more relevant today than ever. He was, although a great, although he had, of course, as a liberal, a very positive attitude towards globalization, he was raising his voice in the 1990s, saying, "Don't fool yourself. You're going to get a polarization in society." So he was a kind of almost a bit of a prophecy at the time of what we go through at the moment, literally in all our societies, which is a big problem for us liberals, and the rise of autocracy worldwide as well. So we are very happy to have this collaboration here with LSE. And I would like to thank Vlad Zigarov from LSE IDEAS for making it possible, and for the contributions, Chris Alden, Richard Higgott, and Ian Beck. And that's it from my side. I will listen. I had a look at the two excellent papers that we are going to be get presented, and it's really for us liberals an extremely important topic. By the way, I'm also president of Liberal International, and we're going to have tomorrow a lecture by John Gray in the National Liberal Club. This is why I was able to combine two wonderful intellectual days, and which made it easier for me to clear my calendar and come to London. So I am looking very much forward to our discussions in the next few hours. And thanks all for making your contribution, for being here. And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me introduce our first of our two paper reports that are being presented. Professor Richard Higgott, who is known to all of you, I'm sure, known first and foremost for his contributions to the understanding international political economy, picking it up from the earliest globalization or our iteration of globalization through to the present day. And it's in that respect we've asked him to write, think, and reflect upon a world that's transforming from a geo-economic logic, an economic logic driven by globalization to a geo-economic, if not geopolitics logic. Richard, of course, is a graduate of LSE at one iteration, and then Australian headed up, I knew him first at Warwick University, where he had the senior management role, provost. Yes, and
Provost,
of course, most Australian universities where he hung his hat for quite a bit of time, but he's come back to join us in the last several years. Brussels School of Governance, EUI, and other places. So I'm running roughshod over a career that spanned time and has involved very, very defining publications, and this I hope will be another of those publications. So, Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the kind introduction. It's not surprising that you run. There's 50 years to cover. I'm not a young man anymore, but there are some good things about growing old. Not many, and I don't recommend you rush into it. But one of the good things about growing old is if you hang around long enough, you see things come around again. So you could almost say that I've lived the life of post-World War II globalization from its first flushes through to the current challenges that it faces. The second good thing about growing old is you're not looking for a job, you're not looking for promotion, you're not looking for tenure, you don't report to anybody. So basically, you tell it how it is. It gives you a freedom of expression that, as a young academic on the way up, you never have that luxury. So, even though, much to my wife's embarrassment, my title is Distinguished Professor of Diplomacy, she thinks I have no diplomacy whatsoever. And there may be elements of this presentation that may be somewhat lacking in diplomacy, particularly when I come to talk about the impact of the current US presidential regime on world order, for example. But the great joy is I don't have to worry about that nowadays, whereas in your line of business, you probably have to be much more diplomatic than I am. So that's my first opening remark. My second opening remark was, I was hoping, and I understand it's been difficult and everyone's been compressed in time and everything. I was hoping you might have had a document that you could have sat with on your lap. Because you haven't, I've prepared some slides. Now, these are not the kind of user-friendly dumbing down slides that you give to undergraduates with pictures and colors and movement. They're dense. It's my text. But in the absence of the document, if any of you feel so moved, my email is on the first page of this. If any of you feel so moved, please let me know, and I'll send you the slides. Now, the paper or the presentation, the report, is an eclectic mixture of scholarship, journalism, and what I call grumpy old man talk. I was given a brief, but only a very general brief. But I've tried to stick to the brief that I was given. So the report looks at three things. It looks at the changing narrative and practices of global order. What I call the shift in the core narrative from globalization to geopolitics. Secondly, it looks at the nature of the new geopolitics, because bear in mind, this isn't the first time we've been living in an age of geopolitics. You can go back to the late 19th, early 20th century. And it picks out three influences. One, the influence of Donald Trump, who I would describe as an incubator, not an initiator of the trends that exist in the current environment. The second, is a return to this old-fashioned idea of spheres of influence. And the third thing I talk about is this thing called strongman leadership. Again, it's a popular cliche that people talk about nowadays, but it has more significance than I think we actually give to it. So I want to talk about that too. The third thing that I do in the report is I look at the implications of this age of geopolitics for Europe. especially the future of transatlantic relations. And also, I pose the question, can we think about world order without the United States nowadays? Lots of people are doing it. Lots of people are talking about it. I try to encapsulate this literature and offer a couple of ideas about it. And the final thing I do, I finish with 8, because I was asked to come up with some recommendations. I finish with 8 recommendations on what, for want of a better expression, European policy types, the policy community might want to think about. They're really more suggestions than recommendations, because some of them I think are self-evident, but that doesn't mean we necessarily follow them. Okay, whose world order? We live in the age of cliches. The 2 major cliches that we live with are endism and newness. The end of the West, the end of history, the end of the liberal international order, the end of the rules-based order, the end of hegemony, etc., etc. And newness, the new anarchy, the new sovereignty, the new Cold War, the new age. It's not like that. These are all basically overhyped and underspecified cliches. The contours of the evolving world order I want to suggest to you are unclear. It's no longer unipolar, it's no longer bipolar, nor indeed is it multipolar. And I'm sure some of you here talk about the multipolar. I resist the notion of a multipolar world. Rather, I suggest to you that what we live with is a complex, fuzzy, fungible, bifurcated order with permeable boundaries. For sure, the US and China remain the dominant actors, but not in a tight, disciplinary Cold War sense. Other actors are significant: Russia, India, sui generis, the EU, powerful northern. I wrote a book 35 years ago on middle powers. It died a death. The last 5 years, I've never been so popular. Everyone wants to talk to this guy who wrote this book on middle powers 30 years ago. I find it strange that suddenly we're all beginning to talk about middle powers again. But there are powerful northern and now southern middle powers flexing their muscles, and I'll say a bit more about that. And of course, we've seen the rise of this other great cliche, the global south, BRICS, SCO. So this change in narrative, I capture it in the expression, it's autumn for globalization and springtime for geopolitics. As we all know, the neoliberal economic agenda of globalization did some fairly dramatic things. It brought nearly 1 billion people out of poverty. It generated massive growth. It changed the nature of the international economic balance of power. But it also had negative political externalities, captured, if you like, in the insouciance of the global cosmopolitan elite beneficiaries of it, who ignored the impact that it was having on the industrial working classes of the advanced OECD world, and particularly in the United States. And it gave rise to negative, often xenophobic, populist politics, and paved the way for the resurgence of a sovereignty-driven discourse of politics. The other thing, of course, is it basically thrust geopolitics back again to be the most contemporaneously powerful metaphor, ideational metaphor, in the lexicon of modern international relations. A modern theory, or theories of geopolitics, of course, go back to the social Darwinism at the end of the 19th century. And indeed, it would be remiss of me not to mention that one of the principal, or the key geopolitics person of the early 20th century was a director of the London School of Economics, Halford Mackinder, who, along with Nicholas Spikeman in the first half of the 20th century, and Kissinger and Brzezinski, had given their different views notwithstanding, in the second half of the 20th century, were basically geopolitics people to their core. And the essentially statist approach of IR that privileges state power is what we think of as geopolitics. The growing great power rivalry of the last 2 decades has seen a surge of geopolitics, influential after that relatively brief Cold War, quasi-liberal, unipolar, post-Cold War, quasi-liberal, unipolar moment of American hegemony. And that's in some ways where we are now in what I call the return of geopolitics. Growing strategic rivalry is the metaphor, the order of the day. It contrasts with what we might call the multilateral collective action problem-solving view of world order that existed briefly in the last quarter of the 20th century, and in some part during the Cold War as well. And this shift towards a geopolitical narrative is not without major implications when it comes to long-term stability of the international order and the core existential questions of international relations. Great power politics, geopolitics style, has a self-fulfilling impact in some ways on the militarization of geopolitical strategy. It's the major contribution to what I call threat inflation and the security dilemma. Modern Western geopolitical analysis, in its search for threats and enemies, does not simply analyze, and it does analyze, of course, but it in fact also exacerbates politico-strategic competition. I think the discourse of geopolitics can be seen to be exacerbating the competition between the US and China, for example. Just for example, as we didn't give sufficient consideration to the negative externalities of globalization, we are giving similarly insufficient consideration to the negative externalities of geopolitics. And at the risk of sounding vaguely mischievous, beware the vested interests of popular media-savvy security specialists. It's their moment in the sunshine, whereas 25 years ago it was the neoliberal economist. None of them are without their skills and their benefits and their utilities, but none of them are without their dangers to how we organize and think about international relations either. So what are the second set of implications of geopolitics? Firstly, assumptions about the role of the United States have turned out to be wrong. 3 reasons for this. 1, the costs of hegemony have proved to be much higher than was expected. 2, other great powers, China and Russia particularly, have actually resisted the assumptions of US primacy. And 3, US economic and military preponderance is proving to be more fragile than was thought. This trend was observable. It's popular to blame everything on Donald Trump. That's a mistake. It would be easy, but it's not the right thing to do. The trends were observable prior to Trump. Think back to Putin's 2007 Munich Security Conference speech. Think back to the global financial crises at the end of the first decade of the 21st century. These were signifiers. Think about the failures of the Obama administration. I mean, everyone looks back to the Obama days and thinks, oh, the good old days of Obama now. But he's responsible in his own way for some of the problems that we face now. I mean, his lukewarm responses, for example, to chemical weapons by Assad in Syria, the Russian annexation of Crimea, his much vaunted pivot to Asia was, in policy terms, without substance. The trends have been exacerbated by the practices of Donald Trump in his first and his second administration. And Trump, I would argue, is prepared to accept a multipolar world, provided he controls the Western Hemisphere. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Crucial for Trump is his desire to be a strongman. And I've written, I mean, strongman's become a cliche, but it's actually, you can see the importance of it if you think of it analytically. And I've written a piece that's gaining a lot of attention on the masculinist, it's not a gender divide, but a masculinist definition of strongman. I mean, women can be masculinists as well. That's why it's not a gender divide. And I'll try and say a little bit about that. I mean, he wants to be like Putin and Xi Jinping, the two people he most admires. Clearly, there's a strong preference for great power competition. Liberal assumptions of multilateral collective action don't carry the order of the day nowadays. Great power, international divisions of labour underpinned by bilateral transactional activity is the order of the day. We live in an era of what we might call great power collusion, managed by strongmen who work together. The US foreign policy agenda, when viewed through the lenses of spheres of influence, again an old-fashioned 19th, 20th century term, is much less frivolous than at first sight appears. Trump's desire to control the Panama Canal, annex Greenland, incorporate Canada, create the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America, and interestingly, his love affair, or maybe turn it the other way around, Alexander Stubbs' love affair with Donald Trump, and the relationship between Finland and the US in building icebreakers for the North Atlantic. This is all part of Trump's view of the US as the dominant figure in the Western sphere of influence. Now, this, of course, is in theory. Great powers do not always carve up the world. And it's not necessarily that that's how it's going to turn out. But it's quite clear, and for reasons I explained there, it's quite clear that that's the agenda. But none of this could be explainable, the recent international relations, the bilateralism, the transactionalism, if we didn't consider this idea of the... Actually, when we think about international relations, we talk about, as you all know, agency or structure. And we all tend to think that structures are more important than agency. It's a terminal, endless, circular debate in international relations. Very often do we actually think analytically about the psychology of international leadership, of people as leaders. This is usually the stuff of management studies and sociology and organization theory, not IR and security and IPE. But what we're seeing is the growing desire and the impact of strongman leaders to control the big ticket items in international relations. Many of them have abandoned the normative political niceties of diplomacy. They favor transactional power and intimidation. So reforming the post-liberal order, the creation and preservation of dialogue in a post-Cold War era becomes extremely difficult because on balance, those people in charge are not by inclination multilateral conciliators. And bear in mind, when we talk about institutions, we engage in what I call not what I call, but what we call anthropomorphosis. That is, we treat states as people. We talk about them as though they're actually actors. But bear in mind, when we're talking about leadership, it's people that lead. Persons speak on behalf of states. States don't speak to each other. Now, this means inevitably that leadership is psychological, personal, stylistic, not institutional and contextual. It's not about subject and place. It's about people. Really do we dwell on this in international relations? All too often we avoid it because it means criticizing people, saying that Joe Bloke's not a good bloke or whatever. And it was only really, I would suggest, that in the last 6 to 9 months, particularly Trump's disgusting attack on Zelensky in the White House, that we've begun to understand, and this is where I'm not being a professor of diplomacy, the rebarbative nature of this man's personality and the effect that it has on international relations. We can't dismiss it as epiphenomena. We can't say, well, the big ticket items are the structural ones. Sure, America's in gradual decline, but these things are important. Human socio-psychological deficiencies in global leaders is a major cause of our current troubles. Many of these leaders exhibit characteristics that are not conducive to diplomacy or dialogue. And I went to the Mayo, I read the Mayo Clinic's handbook on narcissism. It's massive. But the characteristics that you identify, destructive personality traits such as narcissism, self-absorption, self-admiration, overconfidence, fragile self-esteem, loudness, in contrast to humility, empathy, calmness, etc., predominate. The state becomes an extension of a leader's personalized behavior. Expertise becomes suspect. It's replaced by loyalists. Strongman leaders thrive on coercion, loyalty tests, transactional decision-making. This is all from the psychological literature. And you see it not just in Trump, but in Putin, Xi Jinping, Orban, Bolsonaro, Erdogan, Modi, MBS, Mohammed bin Sultan, and former wannabe leaders like Boris Johnson, for example. So I'm not picking on one person and saying, this is a characteristic of how we actually make foreign policy and international relations nowadays. They're not conducive to diplomacy. This is no mere abstract academic reflection. The characteristics of the strongman leader cast major policy shadows over foreign policy making. The Economist talks about Trump's Don Corleone approach to diplomacy. Gideon Rachman talks about mob behavior. I've just written a paper that will get me permanently banned from the United States called Donald Trump's Gangster Diplomacy. Fortunately, I'm at the age where it doesn't worry me too much. But lack of empathy is one of the key elements, dividing the world into winners and losers, expectations of sycophancy, flattery, the politics of spite and retribution, cooperative approaches are all eschewed. Strongman leaders are usually nationalists. They reject secularism, liberal universalism. They champion identity politics. They often fuse religion, nation, and leader. Putin and the Russian Orthodox Church, Trump and the evangelicals. They talk about themselves as though they are the embodiment of the nation. Think Modi and the new India, Xi Jinping and the Great Rejuvenation, Erdogan and the new Turkey, and Trump, of course, America First and MAGA. Okay, so these are the big contextual issues that affect the nature of contemporary international politics. There are four trends that I think are worth identifying, which the US does little to contain, as it would have done in the past. The four major trends are the one I've already spelled out, the anti-globalization narrative and the consolidation of the new mercantilism. And think of the code words that are used nowadays: resilience, decoupling, de-risking, onshoring, friendshoring. They're not only found in the United States, of course, but in Europe. I think, which one was von der Leyen's? What?
De-risking.
De-risking, thank you. Yeah, von der Leyen came up with de-risking. They're not only found in the US, but we're seeing stirrings of US-style industrial policy in other parts of the world as well. The second big trend I think that's important to note is we talk about aristocracy, bureaucracy, democracy, plutocracy. We now talk about the new technocracy and what we might call democratic backsliding. Decision-making becoming increasingly concentrated in the hands of those who control modern AI, communications, and social media. Obviously Musk, but not only Musk, others as well. And the big question here, of course, particularly important for something like the Naumann-Stiftung with a liberal, I mean, it's terrible when you begin to think, oh, for those good old liberal days. We always used to moan, I mean, as a graduate student when I was here, I used to moan about liberalism all the time. But you think, oh, for the good old days of a bit of liberal thinking. Can democratic states preserve or restore their ability to govern deliberatively? The third big thing, of course, is the declining global trust in the USA. I mean, it comes to something when you think back to the days of George Bush and think, hey, the United States was not so bad in those days. I might be being a bit flippant here, but I mean, the shift in US foreign policy thinking, for example. And you can only actually capture what's changing if you use this helicopter view of the world and make these large generalizations to compare one decade to another decade. But Trump, if he's done nothing else, whether by conscious design or accident, has squandered 80 years of international goodwill for the US in some ways, a deliberate evisceration of the instruments of US soft power, US aid. How many people in here? I've been a Fulbright fellow. I'm sure others of you have been Fulbrights as well. Made a major change to my life. When I went to the US as a Fulbright, I was an angry young lefty who didn't particularly think much of the US. It completely changed my thinking about the sophistication, complexity, and brilliance of elements of the United States. I mean, as a piece of soft power, a $20,000 Fulbright fellowship completely changed my thinking about the way the world works. But the voice of America, for those of you who were old enough to know a divided Germany, the voice of America, the impact of Radio Liberty, the impact of Levi Jeans, popular music, all those kinds of things were incredibly important elements of soft power. The National Endowment for Democracy, USIP, even UNESCO, for all its problems, was not insignificant in that context. The fourth thing, and this is important particularly for Europeans, is the fractured and permanently changed nature of the transatlantic relationship. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So what about European strategy? As Ursula von der Leyen said, the West as we know it no longer exists. The political discourse is now driven at the international level by a transatlantic difference of views on the utility of international institutional collective action problem solving. Europe's major problem is its weak defense and its stagnant market. If Europe is to survive in current or improved form, let alone prosper in a Trumpian era, it must generate a new post-transatlantic strategy. And I'm telling you nothing you don't know here. It's just, I think the utility of the paper, if I can say it's got one, is the contextualization that it provides rather than the originality of any particular element of it. Clearly, it's thinking about developing a new security strategy. Germany is particularly important in this context. The security discourse in Europe now reflects a new truth that we all know about, a new truth for the first time since the creation of NATO. It also must generate enhanced international economic resilience, particularly if we think about the recent, I mean, the Lecker and Draghi reports were actually rather good. The progress made on, well, Lecker's gone the way of most reports, and people still pay lip service to Draghi, but there's not a great deal happening on the Draghi front. But more importantly as well, I think, Europe needs to consolidate budding global partnerships beyond the Atlantic that attempt to secure and support those elements of a liberal international order that we want to preserve, or that we might want to resurrect. I mean, you can see why some people want to get rid of some elements of liberal order, but many elements of the liberal order will survive because they're just plain common sense. You need them. You need to preserve a free and open system in an era of globalization. So, and I've got another 5 minutes.
I think about 5 is good.
Is that all right? Yeah. Now, at one level, I hate to say this, Trump has won He's confirmed the geopolitical momentum. He's changed the nature of diplomacy. He's changed the nature of international trade, or what I prefer to call bilateral trade exclusion, because that's the game that he's playing. And even when he's gone, I don't think we'll put the trade genie back in the bottle. His gangster leadership style basically is not showing any signs of waning. Economic coercion is now a normalized instrument of diplomacy. And the recent Gaza deal, notwithstanding its fragility, a US-led order has ended. And I'm talking about order here, not power. An order has norms, institutions, and practices. The US still has power. It can bring about bilateral transactional influences to bear on individual policy matters, but it can't run an order. The order has ended. And a multipolar world with a semblance of equilibrium is yet to be born. Resisting arbitrary transactional behavior of the world's strongman leaders is proving difficult. Multiple other actors, however, are gaining some kind of traction in international relations. In the absence of a bipolar or a unipolar world, desires to give birth to a new multilateral order are coming into play. And I'm not going to discuss them because I haven't got the time, but several things are important. One is what I call middle powers reduct, the return of this popular analytical category. Relevant again. The interesting thing is, when I wrote this book about middle powers, I wrote about the good international citizens, Australia, Canada, the Nordics, doing good things in the context of a Western liberal order. The new middle powers are nowhere near as deferential as the early northern middle powers were. India, Brazil, South Africa, etc. They are subject to great power divide and rule tactics, but they are responding differently to them. Much more hedging, a lot less bandwagoning. The second group of actors, and they come in the same kind of area, are what we call the swing states. Well, not what I call them, what Charlie Kupchan calls the swing states, the global south and the BRICS. For all the contentiousness surrounding its growth, the BRICS reflects a shift in global structure. Despite Trump's hostility, the BRICS is not simply an anti-Western bloc. It demands a fairer international representation. It has okay, Russia and China are the major states in it, but they're not the only players. Other significant actors are there. India, Brazil, now Indonesia, since earlier this year. Attempts to silo the BRICS misses the point. The BRICS are more than just a symbol of cooperation. They want a new multilateralism, and they need to be treated with greater respect than we've done in the past. So I'm nearly finished. Is a world without the USA unthinkable? Yes and no is obviously the answer. But the US is doing much to basically undermine its position as the dominant leader of a quasi-liberal order. And by sailing into dependence, the late Joe Nye, in his last article with Bob Kahane, talked about how Trump had done much to undermine US interdependence. The Pew Foundation shows data that sees how it's losing its influence. And if you look at recent presidential ineptitude, Trump has managed to lose Brazil and India as constraints in the relationship with China. And of course, there is a lot of anticipatory behavior towards a post-US organized order. And AMS is Anne-Marie Slaughter, whose work you will know. Lots of people like her are now beginning to talk about a world without the US as the dominant organizing actor. Let me finish with my 8 recommendations, or suggestions really, for EU policy types. These are not practical policy recommendations. They're commonsensical messages about what must underpin policy if it's going to work. I think they're obvious, but they need stating clearly. First, you might say this is too obvious. The old order is dead. European leaders should recognize how it's dramatically changed. Most of everyone in this room, I'm sure, understands this. But there are still some leaders who hold to a mythical belief that the status quo ante is possible. It's not. Secondly, the transatlantic relationship has irrevocably changed. Again, most leaders know this, even if they read the changes differently. And even though there is a reset in UK-Europe relations, one of the big fundamental divides is still this so-called special relationship that the Brits, I know you might think, is he British or is he what? I've lived 3/4 of my life in Australia, even though I was born in Britain. I have a view of the Brits that recognises certain things that if you live here, you're probably not quite so prepared to admit. But if push came to shove in the special relationship and the re-strengthening or recrudescence of the European relationship, I'm not sure which way the Brits would jump. I know which way I would like them to jump, but that doesn't mean that that's going to happen. Europe has to basically accept that it's been humiliated, accept that it needs to do something to change this. Europe must recover its lost dignity as an international actor in its relationship with the US, because this will affect how other states see Europe. This will require solidarity, sacrifice, and fortitude. And I'd be particularly interested to hear from my German colleagues here what they think the prospects of that are. Europe, in the absence of serious reform of the international order, must not swap dependency on the USA for greater dependency on China. The relationship is extensive, but it must be pursued cautiously. And I say why. Europe must begin economic reform a la Draghi. It must dramatically enhance its hard security and military power. And Germany, above all, is extremely important in this context, although there will be no European security without the Brits. The Brits and the Germans are the dominant actors in that, as far as, and you can tell I'm no European specialist here. But I think it would be tragedy if Europe lost its normative commitment to improving world order. Von der Leyen's notion that we must be a geopolitical commission and the idea of normative Europe being put on the back burner. That would be a mistake. Europe needs to be an old-fashioned supporter of traditional liberal values of democracy, free speech, religious tolerance, human rights, etc. Last slide, Chris, all right? I can see you looking vaguely. European policymakers should recognise the world is neither bipolar nor multipolar. And Europe isn't the third leg of a tripolar world. There are no fixed poles. Polarity implies order and discipline, and that doesn't exist. I'm sure some of you might want to disagree with this. Europe should also play a key role in building the new multiple forms of multilateralism. Multilateralism should be institutional where possible, but informal if necessary. Brussels, in theory, should play the major role here rather than the national capitals. But it needs the leadership from the national capitals into the collective enterprise. And sorry, that was a lie. This is the last slide. This is the last slide. Europe needs to make a much greater play at developing its network with extra European partners, coalitions of the willing to lead where appropriate in issue-specific areas, informal institutional network building. Europe should support coalitions across the North-South divide, in addition to ratifying agreements with Mercosur, Mexico, finalising negotiations with Indonesia, which I think have just been finalised in the last couple of weeks since I wrote this. And that's it. Sorry, that was longer than I thought. Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, we're disappointed if people agree with everything.
It's done away with the usual, 180 word form or 188 word form that we in politics these days.
Yeah.
It said there's complexity here, and it can be contradictory as well as in sync with other trends at large. So I much appreciate. I've got questions. I know people in the audience have questions. I just
Can
want
I make just one comment? The report, when people look at it, is much more sophisticated than the presentation. There's evidence in the report.
Yes, we know that, we're sure of it. I wanted to jump on, there were too many things to ask, but one of them I wanted to jump on was the question of leadership. Because in fact, you're saying we're in a new world where leadership is front and center and defining. And you ended the talk with talking about the European Union. And I think it's that absence of where is the leadership coming from. You've given us a few ideas as to where conditions where it would come from, where giving Brussels a prominent position, pooling sovereignty in those sense. So how is it that Europe, sort of challenging, can operate in that world that you're describing, where leaders are elbowing their way into the front line and what have you, and supporting their interests as they define them? Is there a structural problem here that puts Europe on the back foot?
I'm not suggesting that Europe wants a strongman leader of the kind I've identified. God forbid we don't want something like that. I simply cannot answer the question, how does Europe create collective leadership where it speaks with one? I mean, if you've looked at the striking success of Europe over the previous several decades, it's been its ability to negotiate in the trade domain with a single voice. That's been one of its great strengths. It made the mistake of thinking that security wasn't important because there'd never be another land war in Europe. And now, of course, it's catching up in that space. I do not, and I'd welcome to hear other people, I do not know how you create the strong single European voice to be part of this more bilateral, transactional, post-multilateral negotiating era. This is where I hope that things like the BRICS can play a constructive as opposed to an obstructive role in international negotiations, where the multilateral urge will not come from a single hegemonic post-Cold War leader, but from a collective discussion. But I mean, if I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be a lazy old emeritus professor.
I put forward one idea from history and then come to the suite, which is if you think of European history and the maritime empire of Venice and the Committee of 10 and all that business, I know that it's a bit fanciful the way I'm thinking of it, but there is a place for and a history that gives us some sense that this sort of group dynamics within a republic, however loosely defined, one can survive in that setting as a trading empire. So I just throw that out there as a thought, not really anything developed as such. Gordon Barrows. People might say who they are.
Thank you very much. That was most interesting and raised us, you can see, many questions. I'm just wondering whether the Commission itself is capable of really thinking through and implementing the role that is required of it. Bureaucratic structures often fail to generate the right type of thinking. Do you see the possibility of, in a sense, a mini think tank of the main players in Europe, trying to put together ideas about how this can be done? Because the leaders of the individual member states are actually much closer to some of the realities than people in the Commission.
I have mixed views on the Commission. I'm a believer in the Commission in one level, and I teach diplomacy in Brussels. I know a lot of people in the External Action Service. They're smart, they're thoughtful, but they are subject to all the vicissitudes of that kind of bureaucratic inertia. That, I mean, people from a think tank in Brussels, you would have things to do with SEPS, Egmont, Bruegel, all these kinds of think tanks, all smart people putting forward good ideas, but they do not translate into joined up policy because of the nature and the vested interests that prevail. And it's at one level the great excitement, the great joy, but the great challenge of Brussels. Brussels is much more complicated and worthy than people outside think it is, but it is always constrained by these kinds of rigid, in some ways, ways of interacting. Other people would know better than I do. I mean, presumably, FNS tries to have influence in EU policy at one level. I mean, you'd be actually making inputs or trying to make inputs into that policy process. You know much better than I do the dilemmas that you face.
Maybe in light of that comment, and maybe Jules Martin will have something to say.
I'm the director of FNF Europe. I can also make a comment about this, but I would like to thank you for your analysis. And I think your general direction really has some points that we have to take on board, and I'm quite excited by that. There is one element that is partly implicit here, and they're also explicit, I think, where you talk about BRICS, the global south, which is this whole idea of competition of political systems, the global competition, where I think we have seen, especially in Africa, but also in Southeast Asia and in Latin America, Europe and the United States really withdrawing and leaving the ground, particularly to China, up to a point to Russia, to other countries. Turkey plays a part there as well, in their economic and political development, which has also to do with this whole debate about autocracy or democracy. And I think in the European Union, we are up to a point having a debate with the global gateway and what have you, about what can be done, but it's not an awful lot that is being done, and we're sort of leaving the space to others. And I'm curious how you see that. Insofar as us being active in Brussels, yes, you're quite right. Together with our partners in Brussels, the Renew Group, the Liberal Party, and others, one is looking at what is happening in the European Union. And I think one of the worries that we have is that although after the European elections we thought that the center was holding, we see that is less and less the case now in debates. In the European Parliament, to highlight the recent vote they had on banning banning the possibility to call anything that is vegan a meat product, and so on. So it's which was an initiative from the right in Parliament, no, from people who many wouldn't expect it. And we see that the center isn't holding as well as we would like. And this is something where we need to be really active. We need to, the political center isn't inspiring anymore, particularly in Western Europe. Eastern Europe, it's a slightly different matter. But in Western Europe, the political center, not just the Liberals, the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, the Greens, and so we are losing ground because it's not inspirational. It's quite conservative. wanting to keep things as they are and being happy with that, and that's not inspiring. And we see that, and that's why part of the reason why we see the rise of the extremes in European politics. And it's a dangerous development, but it's something that you can only solve internally and by mobilizing yourself, not by blaming others, because it's really something you have within your grasp, and it's not happening. So that's where we are very active, but it's an uphill battle at the minute.
Well, I think that's a very interesting. I take it more as a comment than a question, but it allows me to basically build on it. Well, I think if you ask, where are the interesting views of the world coming from? They're actually coming from the South at the moment. We've tended to be dismissive of the concept of the global South. We've been patronizing. Much of the global South still thinks that Europe has not managed to shed its colonial baggage. I don't know whether you remember those ill-fated words of Federica Mogherini, and when she launched the cultural relations strategy, she said, well, of course, we're a global superpower, a cultural superpower. You don't build relationships like that. So there is a very important intellectual relationship to be built with the South, practically from the South. Look at one of the most interesting innovations of the last few years. One of the things Trump did in his first week and his first administration was he pulled out of TPP thinking that that would kill the Trans-Pacific Partnership. What do we have 5 years on? We have CTPP, which is probably one of the more interesting, one of the more potentially functioning regional economic partnerships in the world today. Europe is showing an increasing interest in the relationship with CPTPP.
No, that's their biggest obstacle.
Yeah, pronouncing it, yeah. And it should, in my view, would be it should enter into formal negotiation with CPTPP, for example. If you think about the idea of the West and how we use the West as an expression, what's so very wrong about using the South? We know it doesn't have an institutional hard edge to the idea of the West, but people know what you're talking about when you talk about the West. I actually know what people are talking about when they talk about the Global South now. And the Global South isn't just a plaything. The BRICS isn't just a plaything for the Russians and the Chinese. There are other big serious players there, and they have agendas. In fact, if I think probably the most interesting bits of the report is the section on the BRICS and the Global South. Because I think, picking up on what you've said, that's where the important push for conversation and dialogue is going to come from. It's not going to come from the US. It's certainly not going to come from Eastern Europe. It's unlikely to come from Brussels either. Although there is an awareness that, Europe's got really interested, Brussels has got really interested. I say this being a bit mischievous. I'm in the Centre for Diplomacy, Security and Strategy in Brussels. It's full of security types. They're all excited about EU, Indo-China security cooperation without accepting that maybe they're actually fueling the security dialogue rather than creating a more settled, balanced equilibrium. There's much less talk about the EU Indo-Pacific economic relationship, for example. In that, the very use of the concept Indo-Pacific is a security concept. The Asia-Pacific is an economic concept. And we've swapped the economic concept for the security concept. And okay, this is where I'm a grumpy old man. I don't think that's helpful, quite frankly.
Carl, I have just more comment than a question. I perfectly agree with you that Europe is in a very difficult situation. I think it's even more than that. You lived through a series of massive humiliations in recent times. First, which are interrelated. The first is in the trade field, where Trump could just force, if you like, the Europeans to accept a deal which is completely asymmetric. The Europeans got nothing for their concessions. So it clearly showed that there is some fundamental tool of power lacking on the European side. And what is the issue? I think the key to that is the security. We have lived in Europe, and the Americans, well before Trump, told us for a long time that we have been on a free ride on American security. And that time is over. I think in all, cruelness, Trump made this clear. And you can see it in the conflicts, the actual conflicts that are dominating the scene at the moment. On the one side, Ukraine, Russia, although it's the Russian assault on Ukraine happened on European soil, the influence of the Europeans are limited. And if you look at the Middle East, at the Gaza, Israel matters, then the Europeans are basically absent. So there is a real sea change, here. And I think the key to getting back onto a track of re-establishing the influence of Europe is really pushing up our defense spending. This has to happen. Now, the problem is, of course, that the sensitivity to this issue is not equal within Europe. I'm always joking that you could run an econometric model with just one variable in it to explain the readiness of Europeans to spend on defense. This is the distance to Russia. The closer you are to Russia, the easier it is politically to raise spending. And the further away you are, Spain, Portugal, the less the problem is felt psychologically. So this is the typical heterogeneity of Europe. So I think there is a fundamental challenge here, and without a stepping up of security spending, this will not change. Now, what is the state in a country like Germany? Let me speak for my country. I do think that there has been something like a Zeitenwende, which Scholz claimed, in the sense that people for the first time realize that this is a fundamental change. And I think it's politically very difficult, but there is a new trend towards more spending and a fitter Bundeswehr, and the whole reputation, by the way, of the military establishment has massively improved. In Germany, there was an undercurrent of a strong pacifist mood before, which came from the political left, but went into penetrated liberal and conservative circles. That change is going on, but of course, it takes some time. Final point. I was struck by the fact that you said, you were joking about the news, the new globalization, the many expressions of new. But what you described afterwards, in many respects, is a new globalization. For instance, when the Americans turn away from free trade, and towards protectionism, by the way, which is an old American tradition.
I said historically,
if you take
never
a
went away.
historical perspective, then the big exception was the post-war period. It's not what is happening now. In a way, they are returning to the late 19th, early 20th century protectionism, which has a long tradition in America, going back to Hamilton. So now, in this world, Europe has to look to new partners. And the WTO, the traditional multilateral framework, will not be renewed in any sense, but it does survive as a frame in which bilateral and plurilateral agreements can be embedded. And that is exactly the kind of recommendation in economic terms which one could give to the Europeans. Go ahead and conclude as many plurilateral agreements as possible, and do it without the United States.
Exactly.
So just globalization goes on. I call this in a little paper of mine, the new globalization. This is a geopolitically
I'll add it to my list.
penetrated globalization, but it is still a globalization. And the global south, is growing fast.
Yeah.
India has a growth rate of 7% per annum, and many other countries as well. So there is also a perspective of prosperity here. And if the United States wants to join someday again, well, they are welcome.
Look, I take great encouragement from your comments, actually. No, for two reasons. One, I actually do think that, and I've made the point in the report, that Germany is beginning to make a difference in that sense. I also make the point that, the WTO will never be the WTO again. There will never, ever be another multilateral trade negotiation round. You can't bring nearly 200 people together for that's not going to happen.
Absolutely.
That kind of nothing's agreed until everything's agreed, and it's got to be by consensus, is never going to happen again.
Absolutely.
So critical mass decision making. I read a report a few years ago on the WTO, and we focused on what we call critical mass decision making. If you can get 10 states that produce 80% of whatever it is, then you can make the deal. So I think, let me put a question. Turnberry was what, 4 months ago now? Von der Leyen Trump trade agreement discussion, Turnberry. If Turnberry was held again, would Europe's position be the same? Or do you think it's discovered, how do I put this delicately, a little bit of intestinal fortitude since then? Or do you think it would have been another humiliating, or there's this acronym TACO, Trump always chickens out. If von der Leyen, you've heard TACO, surely. Anyway, if von der Leyen had called his bluff, European economy is the size of the American economy. Do you think that Turnberry would have had the same humiliating outcome? Or has Europe, you look like you're going to, what do you reckon?
I don't think so.
There'd have been no change.
No change. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we're not that far advanced.
No, we are not that far.
Yeah.
We have a couple of more.
Perhaps if it happened again with the experience of what happened there, maybe people learned their lesson.
That's what I'm asking. If it happened again.
Not
Yes.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I think, Natalie, you've been very patient, Gordon. And then others in the back too, if it should you want. Sorry.
Okay, I wanted to quickly get back to the complex and fuzzy world order definition. You said that's what we see when we take the bird's eye view, so to say. I think our present challenge is a little bit that this bird's eye view is a typical European or Western bird's eye view, I would say, because we see these things falling apart, getting fuzzy. If you would ask someone in China, how do they see the global world order, they would probably answer, it's dominated by the US. This is a problem. We want a Chinese-led global order. And of course, we like rules, but it should be our rules. If you ask Russia, Russia also wants this change, but Russia doesn't like rules as much as China. So I guess for us, it stays fuzzy. On the Chinese side, it's pretty clear. So the question is a little bit, can we get to an approach that helps us see how this is really a conflict of narratives also? And in order to come back to any kind of order that everyone agrees on, what would be the necessary factors to come to anything unanimous across the globe, which at the moment, I think the EU honestly is simply too preoccupied to lead with any propositions. The EU keeps falling back on itself, trying to equalize amongst its own member states. We might still grow in member states in the near future. So we talk about liberal values, which is for some partners, of course, a good selling point. For other partners, it may simply be something that is a bit overhauled, and what they really care most about is maybe dialogue. So as long as the EU offers dialogue, there may be, it stays in the game, so to say, especially if the US stays out of dialogue. But that is fuzzy. However, it is fuzzy for us. For other partners, it may be actually more clear in their interests what they want. They want simply to contribute more to the definition. And that is the interesting point, I think, in Brussels, that we still haven't arrived at a very clear understanding of this problem and what to do about it. Because, of course, Brussels also wants to keep its own ideas in the game. And it's very, very centered on the classical liberal values, which we really care about, which we really think contribute great things to the world if everybody agrees. But then simply we face the problem that not everybody agrees. Also, the middle powers don't agree so much, or they agree under certain conditions, depending on the case. So yeah, I guess not sure if you can even answer it, but
Well, it's
what leads to the unanimous definition, possibly, and can the EU do anything more than just offer dialogue?
Yeah, I take it as a comment, and it's a comment that I agree with, and a couple of things I'd add to it. China's view is growing. China knows it's winning the discourse over, for want of a better expression, the governance of global order in the long run. Russia, you're quite right, is a spoiler. China is a revisionist. China wants multilateralism, but it wants it on its terms. The South wants to be heard, the other elements of the South. And they see that they're being heard more by China than they are by the United States. Europe is trying, not very well, but it's trying to engage the South more than it's done in the past. That requires give and take. I mean, not all elements of liberalism will survive. And some elements that I value dearly are, I think, going to go by the board. And if I pick out one particularly, I think the idea of global human rights is something that is not a long... Rights are going to be nationally determined by sovereign states. And it means that you actually have to sit at the table with, and hold your nose with some very unpleasant regimes, because you can find common cause on some things. I mean, like most people do not want to return to beggar thy neighbor trade, the historical American approach that you quite rightly identified. They want open, liberal trade. Deals are being done around the United States I mean, the thing that just embarrasses me at times is because even though I was born a Brit, I consider myself emotionally and culturally to be an Australian, is the appalling vacillation of the Australians. They've got a trade surplus. So the United States has a trade surplus with Australia, but Australia still pays them 10% on all that. I mean, it's just nonsensical. We've just given them this sweetheart deal on minerals. We're paying over backwards for this AUKUS agreement that will never come to serious fruition, notwithstanding what Trump says, and notwithstanding what the Brits think. They'll never get their stuff in on time. So there are always going to be disagreements amongst the middle. And when we talk about middle power, I'm nervous about the concept of middle power because I kind of got.
Sorry, you own it. You got the copyright.
Oh, no,
I'm afraid,
no, it's embarrassing.
So we get to do what we want with it.
Yeah, but there are different. I mean, the new ones, the southern ones, are nowhere near. I mean, the Australians, the Canadians, and the Nordics were always basically Western liberal supporters of the American agenda. The new middle powers are edgy. They've got sharp elbows. They don't bandwagon. They hedge. They balance. And that's one of the big changing natures of, and to get an answer to your question means for Europe to learn from the South about how to conduct their relationships or to concede that they, and I think actually 2 cheers for Europe, 2 cheers for Germany at the moment. I mean, what's happened, I find, as someone with no specialist expertise on Europe, but watching the changes over the last 12 months in your international relations, your security agenda, I find really interesting and quite dramatic. So,
Gordon.
Which, just to pick up on points that you've been making in your analysis, there is work that we do here at LSE IDEAS that very much links in with the points you've raised, because one of the things we focus on is the mind of others, to really try to understand the patterns of thinking by the Chinese, by the Russians, and also needing to do more to think about the way in which the global South thinks about things. Because often we have people dealing with sort of policy at a higher level who are dealing with things on a fairly short-term basis. And they haven't really thought enough about the way in which the other side has been thinking about things historically and in the recent past. It is just to flag that issue as one of the cooperative links between the work of the foundation and the work here.
Thank you. Is there anything, I see people? Yes. One and two.
Gordon's point
Very
as well.
quickly, we're almost at lunch. Yeah.
I mean, we can also now apply the mind of others question to the United States, in the sense that the US is in a very particular Trump period, and that's not going to be a long-term period given his age. But I think it's quite a unique position, not the history of trade policy and tariffs, but the actual personality of the Trump administration as led by Trump. He's an extreme narcissist. Everything he does in the public stage is entertainment factor. It's designed to be the greatest entertainment, but to make Trump look like the greatest thing in the world. So there must be a way that European powers, the EU states, and also NATO members could work out how to approach the mind of the United States in its Trump form, in a way which, for example, I think in the EU you had, was it a group of 26 that kind of excluded Hungary on certain questions with sanctions on Russia. When you do this with the United States, not to exclude them, but to say, hey, you could be involved here and it will make you look good, but we're still going to be strong and confident. And then that's the question of how do you get the members of the EU and NATO to come together to have that confidence to work in a bubble to the United States, but also to work out how to hedge. And my worry is that the United Kingdom doesn't recognize that it's a middle power that perhaps should be hedging and working between, instead of still bandwagoning itself to this idea of a special relationship. But that's another question. as well.
I'm afraid this could be rather true. My view of the UK policies is it's like a dog between two trees. That's its problem. The second thing is the passing of Trump will not see the passing of Trumpism. If it's JD Vance, or if it's, and people seem to be holding out the hope that it might be Rubio, he's turned out to be a nasty piece of work as well. You won't see any fundamental change. And there's depth in Trumpism. I mean, this guy, Russ Voigt, for example, who's the chair of the Office of Budget and Management, he's the real genius behind what's happening in the United States at the moment. So I'm afraid I'm much more Cassandra-like than you are. China is quite explicit on what it wants. I mean, these documents on the future of world order, I mean, they mean what they say. I mean, they're not hiding it. So anyway, I'll finish.
Okay, Hussein Khan, I work at the European Parliament. Just on your points about the strongman and Trump, I see it in my work at the European Parliament. So a couple of our files, for example, just now last week, we negotiated the Arctic file. And on there,
I didn't catch your name.
Hussein Khan. I work at the European Parliament and Foreign Affairs.
Yeah.
So different groups came along, and there's multiple times Russia, China is mentioned, their involvement in the Arctic and all sorts of scenarios. Whereas, for example, in the Greenland paragraph, it talks about foreign interference. US is not named, and the reasoning behind that is the fear of retaliation. So still, there's a whole load of name checking of Russia and China, and one little part where it says US and criticism for US. So that so to answer your question, would it be different? A meeting with von der Leyen and Trump at the moment? No, I don't think it would be very different at all. Where it may differ is if Trump pushes forward with a deal in Ukraine, some kind of like forced kind of scenario.
You can see the separation that's occurred in the last 24 hours anyway.
And having borders changed by force and all this kind of scenario, I think Callas, all she said was it's not nice or something like that was her point. Whereas von der Leyen said, no, we can't have that. I think we will have more the kind of Weimar Plus kind of arrangements where you have countries come together to adapt to this change in US foreign policy. I think that is going to be more the turning point if we are going to see a shift in EU politics towards the US, where it's our security in Europe. But when it comes to trade, etc., it's still very, unfortunately.
Want to say anything? I think just to close things, here's a rattling of lunch out there. Before this meeting, I was on the phone with one of our board members who's very, very key, long-standing role in ASEAN. He was telling me about how that they were going to have side meetings with Trump, and who then may go off to as ASEAN when they do the summit, and Trump may head off to North Korea. He says we're negotiating. They're not sure yet if Vladimir Putin will arrive. Xi Jinping never shows up, sends number twos there. But the idea here is that where was Europe in this setting was the first thing that came to mind. Secondly, the fact that the global South is represented in a key economic institution with political clout as well, is drawing in, is attracting, and that it seems to me the world order is finding its shape in this kind of ad hoc way, perhaps, but something that will be solidified over time. So just to speak to that, and speak, of course, to what Richard's been saying in our conversation, which reflects all of these trends and the search for what it means to have an order that's changing and changing so rapidly. So I think we can leave it at that, but to thank Richard, yourselves again.